Cannery Row, Chapter 23, Part 3 of Chapter 23. But Mac and the boys had something to do now. They boiled meat until it was as strong as whiskey. They put cod liver oil far back on her tongue so that some of it got down her. They held up her head and made a little funnel of her chops and poured the cool soup in. She had to swallow or drown. Every 2 hours they fed her and gave her water. Before they had slept in shifts, now no one slept. They sat silently and waited for Darling's crisis. It came early in the morning. The boys sat in their chairs half asleep, but Mac was awake and his eyes were on the puppy. He saw her ears flip twice and her chest heave. With infinite weakness, she climbed slowly to her spindly legs, dragged herself to the door, took 4 laps of water, and collapsed on the floor. Mac shouted the others awake. He danced heavily. All the boys shouted at one another. Chong heard them and snorted to himself as he carried out the garbage cans. Alfred the bouncer heard them and thought they were having a party. By 9 o'clock, Darling had eaten a raw egg and half a pint of whipped cream by herself. By noon, she was visibly putting on weight. In a day, she romped a little, and by the end of the week, she was a well dog. At last, a crack had developed in the wall of evil. There were evidences of it everywhere. The purse seiner was hauled back into the water and floated. Word came down to Dora that it was all right to open up the bear flag. Earl Wakefield caught a sculpin with 2 heads and sold it to the museum for $8. The wall of evil and of waiting was broken. It broke away in chunks. The curtains were drawn at the laboratory that night, and Gregorian music played until 2 o'clock, and then the music stopped and no one came out. Some force wrought with Chong's heart, and all in an oriental moment he forgave Mac and the boys, and wrote off the frog debt, which had been a monetary headache from the beginning. And to prove to the boys that he had forgiven them, he took a pint of old tennis shoes up and presented it to them. Their trading at the thrift market had hurt his feelings, but it was all over now. Lee's visit coincided with the first destructive, healthy impulse Darling had since her illness. She was completely spoiled now, and no one thought of housebreaking her. When Chong came in with his gift, Darling was deliberately and happily destroying Hazel's only pair of rubber boots, while her happy masters applauded her. Mac never visited the bear flag professionally. It would have seemed a little like incest to him. There was a house out by the baseball park he patronized. Thus, when he went into the front bar, everyone thought he wanted a beer. He stepped up to Alfred. "Dora around?" he asked. "What do you want with her?" Alfred asked. "I got something I want to ask her." "What about?" "That's none of your goddamn business," said Mac. "Okay, have it your way. I'll see if she wants to talk to you." A moment later, he led Mac into the sanctum. Dora sat at a roll-top desk. Her orange hair was piled in ringlets on her head, and she wore a green eye shade. With a stub pen, she was bringing her books up to date. A fine old double-entry ledger. She was dressed in a magnificent pink silk wrapper with lace at the wrists and throat. When Mac came in, she whirled her pivot chair about and faced him. Alfred stood in the door and waited. Mac stood until Alfred closed the door and left. Dora scrutinized him suspiciously. "Well, what can I do for you?" she demanded at last. "You see, ma'am," said Mac, "well, I guess you heard that what we done over at Doc's some time back." Dora pushed the eye shade back on her head, and she put the pen in an old-fashioned coil spring holder. "Yeah," she said, "I heard." "Well, ma'am, we did it for Doc, you may not believe it, but we wanted to give him a party, only he didn't get home in time and, well," she got out of hand. "So I heard," said Dora. "Well, what you want me to do?" "Well," said Mac, "I and the boys thought we'd ask you. You know what we think of Doc? We wanted to ask you what you thought we could do for him that would kind of show him." Dora said, and she flopped back in her pivot chair and crossed her legs and smoothed her wrapper over her knees. She shook out a cigarette and lighted it and studied. "You gave him a party he didn't get to. Why don't you give him a party he does get to?" she said. "Jesus," said Mac afterwards, talking to the boys, "it was as simple as that. Now there is one hell of a woman. No wonder she got to be a madam. There is one hell of a woman."